Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining us in the UBC Learning Circle today. Hope everyone had a great long weekend. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam speaking people, and it's a real honor to be able to be in this space and to share and learn from one another. Today we have Leslie Varley here for part 2 of a series on Indigenous health leadership. And I'd just like to remind everyone that sometimes in this space our material is sensitive or potentially triggering, so we encourage everyone to have a support network in place for yourself. If you feel you need to take the space to step away and talk to someone, to please do that, whether it be a trusted friend or family member, a counselor, an elder, or somebody to talk to, and to take care of yourself today. So I'm Miranda Kelly. I'm the Education Coordinator with the UBC Learning Circle, and it's my privilege to be hosting today's session. I'd like to introduce Leslie Varley. She's joining us today. She's the Executive Director of the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres. And her team focus on supporting the 25 member centres, providing frontline services to Indigenous people. Previously, Leslie held the Indigenous Health portfolio at Provincial Health Services Authority, where she led the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety Training. Leslie's community work has focused on ending violence against women and girls. As an Indigenous advocate, she's had roles in both provincial and federal governments, and with and for Indigenous communities. She's a member of the Killer Whale House of the Nisga'a Nation, and she holds the name, my goodness, you might need to help me. Thank you. And that name means one who leads Indigenous people. She has a master's in business administration from Simon Fraser University and resides in beautiful Lakwundjin territory in Victoria, BC. So thank you so much for joining us today, Leslie. It's really a privilege to be here and to be able to pick your brain a bit on your experiences as an Indigenous leader in health. Thank you. So we don't have a PowerPoint that we'll be sharing today, just to let you know, so that's why you can't see any slides at the moment. And first I'd like to start off, Leslie, to talk about the paper that you published on leadership. So for those of you who haven't found it, there is a link to it on the page for this session on our UBC Learning Circle website. The paper is called The Challenge of Indigenous Leadership Within Mainstream Organizations. And in reading this paper, I certainly felt like I could relate to a lot of the experiences that you were sharing from your own experience as an Indigenous leader. So I thought I'd start by asking you what prompted you to write and publish this paper.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I know it's Tuesday after a long weekend. Is it Tuesday? So thanks for waking up and joining us. That paper. I was working at PHSA for, I think, about 8 years, and it was very frustrating as an Indigenous woman leader to be working in that organization. And my role was to, I was hired to make change, to advocate for change within Provincial Health Services Authority, which has about 24,000 employees now. And I was, as the director for PHSA Indigenous Health, I was sort of the highest ranking Indigenous employee, and it was an impossible ask, and it was really frustrating, and it was very difficult to work in a mainstream organization with my own Indigenous values and beliefs and customs and ideas, and so I wrote that paper to help myself with my own wellness and to try to maintain balance and to convince myself that I wasn't crazy or that I wasn't an unfit leader or a poor leader, that I was just a different kind of a leader, and it wasn't a good fit for me to be at PHSA or to be in a big, large, mainstream, predominantly white organization. I'm not picking on PHSA per se, but I think it would have been the same experience in any health authority.
Mm-hmm. And you write that your you were recruited for your skills and knowledge and values as an Indigenous person, and yet you were measured by mainstream leadership norms. Can you elaborate on how that experience impacted your views on leadership, and also, what measures of leadership you measured yourself against, and how that differed?
So I think in mainstream leadership organizations, the one thing that they ask you to, or that you're expected to do if you want to excel, is you have to be really agreeable and you have to stand out. So don't forget, I'm hired to advocate. I'm hired to point out all the places where Indigenous people aren't receiving services in mainstream healthcare. And so my job is almost to, to constantly be that person saying, oh, well, this is why we don't get these services. This is why, we don't come into the healthcare system. And so it's really tough to be one of those kinds of leaders, those sort of mainstream leaders where you're sort of getting along with everybody and you're collaborating and being a team player when there wasn't really anybody on my team. So it was just a different kind of, I had a different kind of a leadership value as well. I kind of prefer to be more thoughtful and reflective rather than, jumping onto answers just like that. And that gets rewarded in mainstream, that quick to answer, quick to talk, quick to jump in. Those kinds of leadership styles aren't my leadership style. And so thoughtful, reflective people don't get rewarded for, in mainstream organizations. It's not easy. It's not easy to find that space to be the kind of leader that I needed to be. We would have meetings. You could spend all your day at meetings, and you had to be on right there and then at that meeting. You had to have the exact right answer that would make people go, oh, aha, I get it. And sometimes in those meetings, I felt like people just weren't listening. They were all just waiting for their opportunity to talk. And so you're trying to, sometimes it's just like, oh, I give up. Or sometimes you're hoping that you're looking around the room and you're hoping that you have made a connection with one person. And I very specifically remember some of those times when somebody would come to me after a meeting and say to me, the penny dropped for me. And then I would see later on, 2 meetings later, that person had forgotten that the penny dropped for them. They forgot what they learned. So in that sense, it was just really difficult to try to raise the profile of Indigenous people in the healthcare system and try to help them understand us so we could get along better together. And I ended up, most of the time, it felt like I had to explain myself and explain Indigenous people. And for white mainstream settler Canadians, they never felt any, it was highly unusual for them to have to explain themselves to me or to reflect on their own privilege or values or why they behave the way that they behave in meetings. It was always me having to do the explanations, and it was always me having to explain all Indigenous people all across North America to a room full of settler Canadians. So it was never an easy experience.
Mm-hmm. I could see how that would get really exhausting after a period of time of feeling like the system and your peers within that system aren't owning Indigenous health. They're looking to you to carry it for everybody.
Yes, you can do it. And so essentially, it gets a little bit ghettoized. It gets impossible to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for in Indigenous health when it's sort of, oh, well, that's just Leslie's portfolio and, we'll just leave it to her. When it was everybody's responsibility and very few people were taking up their responsibility.
Mm-hmm. So when you were in that system and you were, as you say, holding the highest position as an Indigenous leader, how did you find mentors for yourself or your own Indigenous leaders? Did you have to look outside of the organization, or was it your family or your roots and community that helped you find leaders to inspire you?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think I have always been seeking out mentors and people who I've been really deeply influenced by. I remember when I was young, going to college here in Vancouver, and I was hanging out with, I was following leaders around, asking them questions about, big picture questions, just trying to get a understanding of Indigenous issues. And I followed them around, and I would hang out where they would hang out, and get to know them, and they eventually became friends. I think at first they just tolerated me, and then and then they started to, allow me to hang out with them. So I was always sort of pursuing those kinds of people, and I had a lot of mentors along the way. I remember one of my first and most important mentors is a woman called Debbie Williams from Cowichan Tribes, and Debbie was the director of the Friendship Center in Duncan, Hialelam Center. And Debbie has this just calmness about her, and I was always sort of this high anxiety kind of person. I was always outraged at how at the racism, and she would just be, she'd always have this calm. She never said, like, Leslie, calm down. This racism isn't going to go away because you've showed up in Duncan. But she just like, she never shut me down, but she kept me calm. So people like that, I've had a lot of women leaders, Cheryl Ward and Nancy La Liberté at PHSA Indigenous Health. I mean, even though they worked for me, I held them in high esteem. I mean, I would say I had a talent for hiring amazing, bright, capable leaders. And Cheryl and Nancy were huge influences for me. So there's been a lot. I remember actually meeting Nadine Caron here at UBC years ago, looking at her, and she was still a student, thinking, oh my God, that woman is going to be amazing. And she already was. So lots of people like that I've just sort of met along the way, and thought that they were absolute amazing leaders. Women, quiet leaders. There's been male mentors too, but for the most part, I think about the women that are, the people who slog on and don't give up, and they're not about ambition or making fabulous money. They're change agents. They're advocates. They want to change the world. Those are the people that impress me, that I want to be like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the values and the approaches to leadership that you learned from those mentors are quite different from the leadership you were observing within the mainstream health system.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you wrote a bit in your article about the role of silence. Mm-hmm. And I found that really interesting. It was something that resonated with me in the way that a conversation in a mainstream system with non-Indigenous peers around you in the room, there wasn't much space for silence. Mm-hmm. That silence got filled very quickly. Versus your experience in Indigenous conversations, feeling like that silence was really necessary and honored. Can you speak a bit to that, and how you felt, and sometimes having to force your way into a conversation to have your view heard?
Sure. Yeah. Sometimes when you're in those kinds of boardrooms and there's only an hour and a half for a meeting at the most, people are really keen to get their points across. And sometimes, frankly, it feels like people are just showing off at the meeting. Sometimes they're just, trying to impress somebody. And so I had a tough time at those meetings, because I'd always be thinking, sometimes when I did have something to say, I found it was, even if I'd positioned myself so that I was ready to say something, or sitting forward, it would just get ignored. Like, people would just, it was almost like, the sort of university debate in the classroom area, where people are just sort of jumping onto the next open space, and it just carried over into professional work life. So it was really difficult. And I found with other Indigenous people I would talk to, that they had the same kind of experiences, that it was just frustrating that that there wasn't any pauses or time for people to think, that person just said the most brilliant thing, and let's just pause and reflect on that for a minute. Let's let that land on us. Let's let that sink in. None of that happened very often, and if it did, it was often a white male who would say something that we would all have to be like, oh, that was brilliant. So, and then they would make room for me sometimes by saying, oh, Leslie, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have anything to say? And you'd be really frustrated, because I'd be thinking, yes, I did have things to contribute to this, but there hasn't been the time or the space for me. In my article, I talked about how my colleagues and I taught each other to interrupt. So you would be talking, and I would be watching your mouth, and I'd be listening for a natural pause in your conversation, and I would be taking a breath, getting ready to cut you off as soon as you had that little pause in your conversation. My colleagues and I taught ourselves to do this. We actually practiced with each other, cutting each other off, so that we could learn how to jump into those conversations, in boardroom sessions or in meetings with other people. It was ridiculous, and we laughed at it. But at one point, we were sitting in a meeting, and there was 6 of us around this round table, and 3 Indigenous women on one side, 3 non-Indigenous women on the other side, and the 3 Indigenous women, we just sat there listening to them. They asked to meet with us, but they just talked amongst themselves for about 40 minutes, until I finally just thought, I looked at my colleague and nudged her. I was like, okay, get ready, we gotta jump in. We've got to jump into this conversation. And so I wanted to write about that experience, because it literally got that crazy, that get invited to a meeting and being asked to come to a meeting to talk about an Indigenous health issue of some sort, and then not even being talked to. Just, we're just sitting there like lumps, feeling silly. And, and then that brings out the outrage in me, and the, sense of injustice. I mean, you ask me to lead Indigenous health, and you bring me to meetings, and you treat me and my colleagues this way, where you don't even, you just argue amongst yourselves or talk amongst yourselves while we're sitting here. So those are the kinds of experiences that I wanted to sort of, I guess, just purge, write it down, get it out, and let it go.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were finally kind of forcing yourself to interrupt and have a voice in that conversation, how was that received? Was it like, oh, this is just how we just naturally interrupt each other, it's fine, no big deal? Or were you perceived as being confrontational or adversarial in those conversations when you interrupt?
Well, I rarely pointed it out. It's just something that you observe about people, and that they don't, but I didn't, it wasn't something that I wanted to. I just thought it would be really rude to point it out, that people are being rude. So it was something I just tried to find workarounds for, from my own lens and my own way of being. And like I said, I would practice looking at you, waiting for you as somebody talking, to try to get in and have what I had to say said. So it was never an issue that got resolved, because it was never the same group of people in the same meeting every time. Sometimes people would ask me, or give me space, or sometimes, it wasn't constant, but it was, most of the time. But sometimes I did find space to have things that I said, or that I needed to say said, and usually these discussions would be about health equity. They would say, oh, that's a very good point, Leslie. Oh gosh, look at the time. So we need to make a decision here. So, and then, if the good point was sort of wasted, it didn't land. There was no, taking it in or reflecting on it. So sometimes I would point out, well, the very process that we're doing, or or taking to address health equity is not going to work. It's not an equitable process. I'm the only person in this room who's probably ever experienced poverty or any kind of health inequity, and I'm just being ignored. I'm just, and the examples that I'm giving or the suggestions that I'm providing are too difficult. So one of the things that used to drive me crazy in that whole area was when health leaders would decide to address health equity by picking the low-hanging fruit. I despise that term because I heard it so much. So, you can't reach health equity by picking the low-hanging fruit, by taking the easy routes. And so, I would just sort of want to bang my head on the table at that point, thinking, okay, health equity isn't about picking the low-hanging fruit. Health equity is about, trying to address the people who have been excluded and are not accessing health. So it was just, all those kinds of experiences were really, really frustrating for me. Or, in the interest of time, thank you for that point, Leslie, but in the interest of time, we have to move on. I'm thinking, we've just wasted 45 minutes talking about stupid things, and now, we're trying to get to the point, and now in the interest of time, we have to move on, or we have to make a decision, and we have to make a quick decision now because we haven't actually spent any time really reflecting or inspecting or critically analyzing these issues. So it was frustrating on that level for me to not be able to be the only voice at the table, and to not be able to get the group to look at the real issues that were there. Sometimes I had a colleague there and we would tag team. We would set it up sometimes ahead of time saying, okay, so when I say this, you need to back me up. Sometimes you have to do that, right? And so one time, and this is something I'm not proud of, don't do this at home. I actually got a colleague of mine and we just played this silly game of holding the floor. Let's just hold the floor. Let's see how long we can hold the floor in this room. And just saying silly things, and then as soon as my colleague would stop, I would start, and as soon as I ran out of stupid things to say, and but this was the kind of experience that we had, and I wanted my mainstream colleagues to see how, a lot of what they were saying, they might have impressed each other, but to us it was nonsense. It wasn't equity, and so we played that game once, and I confess, it was very unprofessional, and I regret it. But it didn't make the point that I wanted to make. People were just looking at me thinking, "What are you doing? Why are you wasting our time?" But they didn't reflect that, they didn't get the. So maybe it was too subtle. Maybe I should have said, "So this was an exercise in."
Right. Yeah, well, you mentioned a number of times time, and it sounds like you were getting a lot of pressure to meet certain time frames that didn't necessarily mesh with how you viewed using the time and the time that you needed to follow a process that felt appropriate to you. Mm-hmm. Was that a continuous challenge for you in your time as a leader in a mainstream organization, like confronting that difference in values of time?
Yes, it was really tough. There's, of course, when you work inside, government or NGOs even, there's, the whole thing about fiscal year end and about, our health equity issues would be turned into projects, and they would have a time frame and a budget attached to the project. Right? So the project of mental health or youth suicide would have a time frame and a budget, and it was really, think about that. How that's crazy making in and of itself, right? So the whole 150, 200 years of colonization is now going to be addressed in this, $2 million 18-month project of, Indigenous youth suicide, for example. So those kinds of false time frames where, we had to have this project done because it was now going into this report or into, it was a health commitment made, and the Ministry of Health wanted to see it so that somebody, some government could announce that this was being done and it was being addressed. And in reality, those kinds of those are just limitations, right? If we really want to address youth suicide, it's going to take a lot of people and a lot of time and a lot of reflection and a lot of resources and a lot of help. And but we had, these small, crazy little time frames to do that kind of work, and it was just really frustrating and discouraging.
Mm-hmm. How does that compare to something like Sanyas that has become quite well known, and it seems like it's been a very successful program and that it continues to grow and evolve over time? You were involved in that from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and how did that go differently?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge my colleague Cheryl Ward, who is the real leader behind the Sanyas program. I was the kind of person who, I like to say, just kept my elbows up and kept everybody out of the way so that Cheryl could get her work done. Cheryl is really a hardworking woman. And the funny thing about that program is that we were under the radar and nobody accepted. We were brand new. I was brand new at PHSA, and Cheryl came in. I started in June. She might have started in September, and I asked her specifically to come in and start writing that program. Nobody knew we were there. Nobody cared about us. So our success or failure wasn't being looked at or wasn't being measured. Nobody knew what Indigenous cultural safety was or what it would look like, and I think people had different expectations of what it was. So when it came out, when Cheryl finally put her final product together, it was a surprise. People were like very surprised that it was so good. And it was long. It was 24 hours long or something, and we had to cut it down to, the instant feedback that we got was that no healthcare worker was going to take 24 hours worth of cultural safety training. And that was during that time. That was about 8 years ago. Maybe they would be more interested in it now. But at that time, so we had to face that reality and had to cut it down, and that was tough. So, but I think the success of that program is that nobody was watching us. And to be honest, at the beginning of that training program, we were using the word racism, and that was a word that wasn't very well accepted. It was a bit of a taboo word in the healthcare system at the time. I mean, you could mumble it under your breath, but you couldn't actually talk about it, and analyze it. And so we were really strategic in how we actually addressed some of those issues. So we got Dr. John Miller to introduce the term racism in the Sanyas training. He's the tall, handsome, white male doctor. He's definitely an alpha male. He's very looked up to by everybody, and we specifically targeted him to bring out that word racism. So we were very strategic in how we developed the training so that we could get some of the white leadership to talk about some of the issues that were really tough for settler Canadians to hear. So I think that was part of the success of it too, is that we, it wasn't, if I was to talk about racism in the Sanyas program and do my little spiel about it, I'm sure that training wouldn't have gone anywhere. But we were very strategic in getting, very high level, important leadership to come out and talk about some of the issues there that were important to us as Indigenous people. So we specifically sought them. We got Dr. Jan Kristola to play a bad doctor. We got Dr. Liz Wynot to come and talk in the program. And so, we were doing all these small videos, but nobody saw the final picture. Only Cheryl and her team of curriculum writers and developers had any idea what the big picture looked like. So, it was like a little bit of a stealth program that we were developing it behind closed doors, and then launched it on the world. And thought, and then we were worried. We were worried that we were going to get fired for it because we talked about racism and we talked about some tough issues and stuff. And we just thought, well, if we're going to get fired, we're going to go out, in a ball of flames.
Well, luckily that wasn't the case, and it's grown into such a successful and well-known program and a model, I think, that's really been embraced even across Canada, not just in BC.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's amazing. Congratulations, Cheryl.
Definitely. And it's funny to hear the history of that really just being kind of under the radar and this unexpected success, whereas these other projects that were perhaps more high profile ended up being less successful in the oversight of them. Yes,
and more. We had more help on the projects too, and so experts would sort of come in and programs end up not being Indigenous. When you sort of bring in it's hard to maintain control of those kinds of programs in a mainstream healthcare system. It's very hard to maintain control, and it's very hard to ensure that that your program has the integrity that you intended for it to have. So Sanyas is one of those rare successes.
Mm-hmm. And can you speak to your role a bit as a leader in helping the team who created and has run Sanyas to stay well themselves, and in facilitating that training, for example, encountering racist thoughts and racist ideas, and how you kept the team strong in being able to continue that work, which obviously was very demanding and very challenging at times.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a lot of. Cheryl developed a lot of ways to keep the team, to try to help the team to keep healthy, because in the last couple of years since we've sort of got this with Trump as a president, the racism is surfacing here in Canada as well, and not that it's hasn't existed, but people feel more comfortable expressing their racist views now, and but Cheryl and her team were always experiencing that in Sanyas. They were always seeing the wretched, horrible underbelly of Canada, right? The racist values that Canadians hold, and they don't necessarily present or show, but they hold them. And so she had to set out some processes for her team in order to try to keep them healthy. So one of the things that we realized that we needed an elder to help with the Sanyas team. So we brought in Elder Jerry Ullman, and he, every Friday, he gets together with every single facilitator on the team and has a conversation with them. We would have the facilitation team of the Sanyas program are around Canada. They're not all sitting in offices in Vancouver. They actually work from home, and so every 6 months we would bring that team together, and we would do ceremony led by Jerry Ullman, just to help us maintain our own balance and cultural values. We had a lot of discussions. The Sanyas team would get together every week and talk about some of the tough issues, and they did spend a lot of time propping each other up, and they sort of buddied up, and they take time and they take care to make sure that they're all well, because it's tough work, constantly being on the front lines of addressing racism, where you're seeing some horrible experiences that come to us that we would never, you would never believe that this actually happens in beautiful British Columbia. You see death due to racism in, I think in the Northwest Territory and certainly in Manitoba, but nobody expects to see it here. But those facilitators definitely saw that, and it is really tough for them. It's a really tough experience for them. One of the ways that we wanted to, we know that racism is systemic, and that if you address individuals who are acting badly, we felt at the time that that was not going to be successful for the Sanyas program. So we didn't want to out anybody. So it was really tough to try to stay at this higher level, thinking, okay, so we're addressing systemic racism, and so we weren't reporting, because if people didn't feel safe if you're in a learning program like Sanyas and you're not feeling safe and you feel like you might be outed for having, we're asking you to be reflective and you're reflecting on your own racism, then you're not going to feel safe if we're going to report you. So we didn't. We even when the facilitators are talking to each other about an issue that they want to get together on and think how best to respond to this, they never name names. So they make sure that they've got, they've got sort of terms for different types of racism and stuff, and they'll use like a code term for that type of racism, and that is again just to take to enhance the safety for the learner, but also to sort of put a little bit of distance between that and the facilitator so that they're not taking that on. Of course, they need long vacations and long breaks, and sometimes our facilitators burnt out, particularly the Indigenous facilitators. I think it's really hard to be an Indigenous person and to be a facilitator in the Sanyas program. There's that added issue of knowing that this happened to my people, and this is and I personally have safety issues about going into the healthcare system, and this reinforces my safety concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that burnout can happen, especially as an Indigenous person feeling really passionate about the work that you're doing in Indigenous
Mm-hmm.
health, but continuing to confront those sorts of barriers or challenges or the systemic racism over and over and over and over in your daily work. Yeah, so you mentioned ceremony and really that peer support for one another and working with an elder. Was there anything else that you discovered in your journey in leadership that helped you with your own self-care?
Well, I think making sure that you've got a really solid circle of friends that you can lean on and that you can have conversations with about what you're experiencing. And so with the other health directors and the other health authorities and some of our colleagues at the Ministry of Health and at the First Nations Health Authority, we develop friendships and sort of lean on each other and talk to each other all the time to sort of find our way through some of the issues that we're trying to understand or trying to change. And I think the other thing for me is that I had to get out of my own headspace a lot, and so I would, spend the weekend. For me, I like to do things like growing vegetables and herbs, and making jam and marmalade and canning fish, and doing that kind of stuff that's sort of traditional. And I would love to do that. I like to get busy on a long weekend, and just can fish or smoked fish or whatever. That kind of stuff was really important to me. And I found like if I kept my hands busy, then I could sort of try to keep out of my headspace for a while. Another really great way for me to cope was to go on holiday for a month. I couldn't stay in town. You can't, I couldn't go on a vacation where my work phone was with me.
Mm.
So I had to really disconnect, and that's actually hard. I was on a vacation at Christmas time with a couple of girlfriends, and I just learned this, and I want to share this. We were really sick. We were in a beautiful tropical place with a beach, and we were all so sick. I was really sick anyways. I don't know if my friends were that as sick as I was, but they were certainly not feeling well either. It was that 90-day cold flu thing that was going around. So we rented some chairs, and we were sitting at the beach, and we just sat there all day, and we literally grunted, "Lunch? Yeah, there's a food truck over there." And that's almost all we said to each other all day, from 10 in the morning until about 5 o'clock at night when the sun was setting. We sat there all day and didn't talk. So usually the thing that I used to do is just like talk for 3 days about work and decompress that way, get it all out and go over it and analyze all these little details. We didn't do that because we were sick. And the next day we woke up going like, wow, it feels like I've been here for 3 weeks. We felt so relaxed and so decompressed. So try that. Don't talk. Apparently that works too.
Just a day of silence on vacation.
Yeah. The first day.
That's a great tip. I'd like to try that. Yeah. So back to your article a bit. You wrote about the idea that the Western tools and ideologies that are basically creating the problems and the challenges for Indigenous people were the very same tools and ideologies that the system's trying to use to fix the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us can relate to seeing that. And so I guess I wonder, in your experiences, have you had any tips or successes in really trying to bring those Indigenous ideas and Indigenous tools to the forefront of leading Indigenous health and really showing the system how it really needs to be these Indigenous tools and these Indigenous voices and Indigenous leaders that are going to change, the outcomes for Indigenous health?
Yeah, Miranda, I don't think I was successful with that at all. No, I mean, sometimes you are talking, sometimes there's one person in the room that you're talking to, you're speaking to the converted, and they're getting it, but nobody else is. And they might not be the person in the power position who needs to get it and needs to know that we need to change the way we're doing things and change how we're doing things. And often these decisions, these actions, these issues would come down to money. Well, youth suicide it's going to be awfully expensive. We don't want to open that can of worms, and you just feel like, oh God, that's just shattering, right? I mean, did you all just feel that? We don't want to open that can of worms. That just hurts. And so you're trying to think of a workaround while your heart is breaking and while there's no commitment to really address these key issues. So yeah, in all honesty, I mean, I know I talked about it and wrote about it, but I currently don't see a solution for that. I think that it comes down to money and time and have you got one of the things that we felt we needed to do for Indigenous youth was to teach them how to be constructive in their anger. So we were talking about decolonizing their minds, and Jerry Ullman, our elder, talks about decolonizing his body, and he says, I don't eat chips or junk food anymore, I decolonize my body, or I don't drink alcohol because I'm decolonizing my body. And so we wanted Indigenous people to understand, particularly youth, the whole issue of colonization and how it's happened to us, without any real accessibility for us to see it and know it. I've been in Australia and New Zealand, and in New Zealand in particular, the young people know a lot more about colonization than our young people do. And they learn it through their own culture, through their own people. They have a stronger sense of who they are as modern people. And I was impressed by that. And I thought, the whole time that I was in school, I think we studied Indians twice. The first was in grade 5, and I always give the example where they were talking about, Louis Riel. They'd pick any other Indian in history who was a bad person. And then the second time was in the 10th grade when we were talking about immigration. And we were assigned this piece of work to do on immigration. And so we're all settlers, and so we all have to do a piece of, a project on immigration, right? We had to do an immigration poster, come to Canada. and I was saying to my teacher, well, I'm Niska, I'm from just up the road, and I don't want to do that. And they knew my dad. My dad is off the boat English. And they're like, well, I want you to do one for, from your father's perspective, right? He's a new immigrant. And I was like, yeah, but, my mom's been here for a long time. Like, when are we going to learn about, my mom and her people? And they it just didn't happen. It was the same for me in college. I remember in order to do, prior to Indigenous studies coming out, there was anthropology. And that was the only way you could learn about your own people. And I remember we had to do this project, and there were these old books. They looked like they were published in the 1930s. And you had to pick them, and it was from these Indigenous people from all over the world. And I remember sitting at people going up, and it was, it was like a shark attack on those books. People were pulling through them and rifling through them and throwing them down and stuff. And we had to do a book report on one of the books. And so I thought, well, it doesn't matter what, Indigenous culture I'm going to have to write about. So I waited until the very last, and there were 2 books at the very end, and I went to pick them up. One was the Haida, and one was the Niska. My older brother and sister are Haida, and Niska, and I thought, oh, isn't this funny? And so I, read the books, and they were absolutely offensive. They were written from an old school anthropological perspective, and we were sort of half human. We weren't really, human, and it was just awful. It was just horrible, and I was just outraged by those kinds of experiences about, and we didn't have. We didn't grow up knowing the history of colonization, right? We didn't have that analysis as kids. We just grew up in the midst of it. We didn't learn about our own people unless, we had our own cultural values and beliefs. I used to go home to my own family, feasts and funerals and that kind of thing, and weddings, but we'd already, in some sense, we'd already lost some of the, Niska worldview, and it was really trying to recapture that. And there wasn't any place for me to go to try to understand the big picture, like what happened to us? Why are, what is going on here? And it wasn't, I think those kinds of, those are intentional ways that we're colonized, right? So that we don't get to know our own history, so that we're displaced from our own history, from our own people, from our own culture, and it has been successful up until this point. And so one of the ways that we thought we wanted to help youth to develop that sort of constructive outrage at what has happened to, here's why you were here, here's what happened to your parents, here's what happened to your grandparents, here's what happened to the beautiful land that your people came from, and so on. So we wanted to give them something to be angry at instead of being internally angry at themselves, right? Instead of that internalized anger. And how do you do that in a mainstream healthcare system where, it's still in Canada? We're just starting to acknowledge colonization and the impacts that it's had in Canada, and we're just starting to put that whole Indigenous history into our school books. So it was just it's a difficult process to try to do it. I think that kind of stuff needs to happen outside of the mainstream structures. We need to do it as Indigenous people ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And was that part of the driving force for you to make a career transition and go to work at an Indigenous organization?
Yes. Well, the only problem with that is, we're nonprofit organizations, and we don't have a whole lot of money. There's tons of money to do it in the place that I left, but there's no commitment, and there's lots of commitment to do it where we are in the Friendship Center movement. But there's no money. Who's going to give us money to decolonize ourselves?
Right.
So, there's always a challenge, but I have to say it certainly feels a lot better working for our own people.
Mm-hmm.
Feels comfortable. We have our own set of challenges for sure, but I still, at least I can get a word in edgewise. There's lots of silence around the table. There's lots of respectful engagement. There's lots of, dialogue. Yeah.
So you spoke in your article, or wrote rather in your article, about really being open to sharing and learning from your mistakes, sharing that with your team, not being afraid to reflect both on the success and the failures of your working together, and really creating a safe space for learning and growing together. How has that helped you in your career transition and moving from a mainstream organization to working in an Indigenous organization?
About learning from my mistakes? I think one of the one of the things as a leader that I was always trying to achieve was to let all the people who are beside me, all the people that are working for me, realize that they're the leaders. Actually, I'm good at selecting people to come and work, and they are all leaders in and of themselves, and that we're learning this all together. That there's no map here for where we're going or for what we're trying to do. We're leading edge. We were all hard on our learning edges. We were trying to figure out what was, how hard can you push before people are pushing back? How much information can people take? Where do they have compassion fatigue for Indigenous issues? Which groups don't care about us at all? Because some don't. And which groups are the ones that we need to set our agendas, because we know that we can get them on side, right? So you're looking for early wins, or you're looking for people. There's no sense in banging your head against the wall trying to get people on side who don't want to be on side or don't care. And so those were some of the mistakes that I made along the way, is thinking that everybody cared about us, that everybody was there, even though they were there in the professional capacity to help us. They weren't. Some people didn't want us to succeed. So those were the sort of mistakes that I constantly wanted to share with my staff, so that they could see, oh, okay, so this is how it works, right? So they wouldn't be, when they assume my role, that they're not, disappointed, that they're, that they know what the reality of the situation is, and that they're going to, so this didn't work, so you might want to try something else. Because we tried that, we tried going straight through. You might want to find a go-around. So I think it was really important for us to share our mistakes and to know what worked for us and what didn't work for us. And as a leader, I also value trying to, we try to be human, we try to be humble in our leadership, and let people know that we make mistakes, and that, not every decision we make is a good decision. And sometimes we're set back by that, but if we acknowledge we've made those mistakes, people are, a little bit more responsive and appreciative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that's one of the differences you see in Indigenous leadership versus the leadership you were experiencing in these mainstream organizations, is really having the humility to share one's mistakes and also what you've learned from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You were noting in your article that there was almost a disincentive within the mainstream organization to admit mistakes, because it might hold you back from a promotion, or it'll reflect poorly on your annual review, and it might impact your opportunity for a raise, or that sort of reward within that system.
Yes, definitely in that mainstream system where when you're doing your annual review, if you actually admit that I think maybe one mistake is fine, but if you admit to making all kinds of mistakes, and acknowledge that you're growing through those mistakes, it's almost like it is a disincentive, right? Because people are kind of looking at you going like, stop talking. I want to give you a raise, but you keep admitting that you've made mistakes. And it's funny because, the whole incentive system is set up on, you did this and you accomplished that and you got that in on time and on budget. Well, I, proposed to write this, or to develop this youth suicide prevention program for Indigenous youth. So what if we got it on time and on budget? Did it save any lives? That's the real question. And how do we know that? And, and along the way, we might have made these mistakes, right? This didn't work. We didn't get it done because of this or that or whatever. But it was it's difficult to sort of get into that sort of leadership mode when you're almost trying to hide or cover your mistakes, right? Or you're reframing them as, well, I was successful because I got it in on time and on budget. Yeah, but did it do anything? Did it actually change anything? There's more to leadership than getting things done on time and on budget. So what's the actual value of the contribution that you've made? Has it been useful? Is it being picked up by Indigenous community? Do the kids actually like the program? Is it helping them? Is it effectively helping them to start thinking about decolonizing their minds? Those are the kinds of things that aren't necessarily in that and you've got like 15 minutes to sort of make your pitch about how fabulous a job that you've done all year. And so don't admit to any mistakes. That's my lesson in that process, and I did write about that. It was a bit frustrating.
Yeah. And so has that influenced how you do your work now in an Indigenous organization? Do you use different measures of how your staff are meeting success in their journeys, or if your programs are meeting success?
Mm-hmm. Well, in our yeah, for sure, we spend a lot of time together as managers, talking and analyzing the issues and thinking about what needs to change and thinking about those kinds of things. So it's a completely different kind of experience when you're working with with Indigenous organizations. So having a lot of those kinds of discussions, and everybody's got the same kind of experience that I have too. So that's a different process. And we also know, that we don't sit in the boardroom and yell at each other. We engage, and as I said, there's a lot of silences. People are being reflective. So it is a different kind of experience altogether, and it's healthier, and it feels better for sure. It feels more. I feel more at peace with myself, and also I don't have to be, in my previous role, I had to be the one person advocating all the time, trying to find a way to jump into the conversation, or trying to find a way to get all of these people to see this issue from an Indigenous lens. And I don't have to do that anymore. Everybody sees the same issue from an Indigenous lens. We're all just trying to figure out where do we get the money to develop the program to change it.
Right. Well, we have about half an hour left. We've started having some comments and questions on webinar,
Okay.
So maybe now would be a good time for me to read out some
Sure.
of these to you. So Catherine asks, she says, thank you, Leslie, for the great discussion. She's wondering about formal education as a part of the journey toward becoming a better leader. She writes that she knows you recently completed your MBA in Aboriginal Business and Leadership. Do you feel that completing this degree enhanced your ability to be a more effective leader in health?
I was wondering that myself, Catherine, recently. How much of that MBA do I actually remember? I think here's the thing. When I was really young, I thought I was going to come to UBC and go to law school. But I also knew myself well enough to know that if I went to law school when I was in my early 20s at UBC, I would have come out at the other end of law school in a navy blue suit as a corporate lawyer working in downtown Vancouver. And I would be so much further from the core of myself as a human being than I already was. And I was kind of lost already, just as a, mother who was in residential school and trying to find my way back and trying to figure things out and know myself. So I knew that much about myself, that I knew that I wasn't ready to, even though I really wanted to go to school and go to law school, I knew that I wasn't ready for that I would just come out very, very, I suppose the term is colonized. And so as a mature person, I sort of came back in and dabbled in different subject areas, and I think education is power, knowledge is power, and for me to I've written an article and published it, and I really only published it for my own wellness, but I think it's still I think education is a hugely valuable tool, but for me I didn't want to get into it at the expense of myself, if that makes any sense, at the expense of not becoming solidly who I am and knowing who I am before I went in. Now, I've met lots and lots of really young people who have gone into university at 18, and they have a solid sense of identity and a foundation, and they come home and they work for their communities, and they're very powerful people, and my hat's off to every one of those. But I wasn't that kind of a person. I knew I wanted education, but I knew that it might swallow me up if I did it too soon. So I waited a bit.
We have a question from Tlaxton. What is your dream or vision for urban Indigenous people right now?
Wow. This is starting to feel like my job interview. I think the same dream that I have for all Indigenous people is that is the same for urban Indigenous people, that we're valued for who we are, we're appreciated for who we are, we are let in, or we are a part of the Canadian economy, that we have a say in our futures, and we have a say in how our children are raised. Not more than a say, that we actually get to control how our children are raised, and that we can be a part of the communities that we want to be a part of, whether that's the First Nations community, or the Métis community, or the Inuit community, or even just the urban Indigenous community, that we have a sense of belonging. That's my goal or vision, that we belong. We fit in where we want to be.
Thank you. That's a beautiful vision.
Oh, thanks.
Donna writes, hello from Okanagan Territory. Thanks, Leslie. Was informative and can relate to many of the challenges you illuminated. It is important to keep an open heart and keeping in balance.
Thanks, Donna.
So related to your experience in MBA, I'm wondering, when you're recruiting for your team, are there particular courses or training or experiences that you're looking for in what someone can bring to your team?
We've had this debate very, very often. Not necessarily in my new role, but certainly in when I worked with Cheryl and Nancy. We were always very careful to ensure that the people that we were looking at were not only a good fit, had the right background and the right education. It didn't necessarily have to be a formal education, but people with good experience. And you often want that right balance between people who are, have a strong sense of identity with community, and people who are maybe more academically inclined. So it's the same thing for where we are with the friendship centers too. When we're recruiting for positions, my colleagues, my staff would also have a really strong say. And a lot of what we're doing is we're looking for people with passion. I am looking for people who are action oriented, who are going to get the work done, who are going to show up, and they're change agents. They have real passion for the work. I'm not interested in people who are just 9-to-5ing it. I'm interested in people who are making this a life commitment at this place in time to be here, and they want to work for the cause. Yeah. So I'm recruiting for those kinds of people. Sometimes you're trying to look at the gaps that you have in your organization in terms of the experience. So what are we missing here? Who do we have? Do we have somebody who's a good writer? Do we have somebody who's a really good speaker? Do we have someone who's really good with the numbers, that kind of thing? So you're also looking at the gaps of what is your what do you need on your team? So
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so empowering. And I appreciate you sharing from your story of how you purposefully took time before going back to school and pursuing an MBA, but how it inspired you to create these opportunities for exposure, as you say, for young people. Yeah. Start thinking about their career very early. Yeah. So Lisa on webinar writes, as there is great differences in urban versus rural and remote, what do you see to assist all Aboriginal people in all areas of health, traditional and cultural? I loved your comment about women being silent leaders and that you are working hard for the grassroots people.
Okay, what was the question again? What do I see?
What do you see in assisting all Aboriginal people in all areas of health?
Well, Lisa, that's a big question. How do I see helping all Aboriginal people in all areas? I think when I think back on my time working at PHSA with Cheryl Ward and Nancy La Liberté, one of the, when the whole transformative change accord in health came out, I remember I was a consultant and I was doing strategic planning with a lot of Indigenous organizations and mainstream organizations at the time, and I was doing some strategic planning with an Indigenous organization, and I remember, because of what I was doing, strategic planning, I kind of had to have, an understanding of what else was happening in the world and some of the big picture stuff that was coming down the pike, and that was coming down the pike, and I remember looking at that whole process in that document, in the first document, I think it was the paddle document that came out, and thinking, okay, what is the key thing here, to answer your question, Lisa, what is the key thing that would really help Indigenous people everywhere in BC? And for me, it came down to anti-racism. So decolonizing anti-racism, so that Indigenous people in health who had health care concerns felt safe going to their doctor, felt safe going to emergency, felt safe going to the dentist, felt like they weren't going to be judged or that they were going to be dismissed. Oh, you're all Indigenous people are drug seeking, or we're all alcoholics, or we have higher tolerance of pain, so you can just leave them and get to them later because they'll survive. Those kinds of things, right? So those are the kinds of things that I wanted to address, and that was through decolonizing anti-racism. So I think by helping, for me, helping Indigenous people would be about making sure that mainstream Canadians know that we're human, know that we're not all alcoholics, know that we're not all drug seeking, know that we have the same levels of pain tolerance that every other human being has, and it varies from person to person, those kinds of things. So I wanted to make space for people to be healthy, right? Because we weren't going to, I had negative health experiences just going into clinics, going to my dentist. And I started avoiding going into healthcare services because I didn't want to be judged. I would dress up. I do dress up because I don't want to be judged. And we shouldn't have to be doing those kinds of things, like taking these extra steps and extra effort so that we're not going to be judged, so that we're going to be treated with some dignity and respect. And I guess that's what I want for all Indigenous people, both urban and rural, is that we make sure that we've got some space within the healthcare system for safety for Indigenous people specifically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Peter from Chihuahua has a question relating to pay scale. I'm not sure if he's referring to pay equity in terms of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous employees, or if he's referring to pay difference between an Indigenous organization versus a mainstream organization. But maybe you could speak to if you saw any differences in either of those in working in mainstream organizations. Was there pay inequity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff?
Yes, I think so. I think there is pay inequity. I think one of the so in my role, I had a responsibility for Indigenous health across all of the portfolio of PHSA, and when I would point out, the only other person who's got the same kind of responsibility is this person who would be at a much higher level, it would just get, dismissed. Oh, but yours is just such a small piece. And so, of course there are those issues. The directors who have the roles at in the mainstream healthcare organizations, who have those healthcare roles, of course they should be higher. They're expected to do so much more with so little resources and they're heavily, and this is also a very political, so it's not just that you've got, you know, a population of health, you're also dealing with colonial racist structures that they're trying to navigate, and you're also trying to navigate the politics, right? Indigenous and mainstream politics, organizational politics. So they're not easy roles, and they're not very highly placed within the healthcare systems. I think there's only one role in Prince George that's at a VP level. So they're expected to do a lot. I think, you know, to a degree they're a little bit exploited because they're not at the level that they should be. In terms of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous organizations, I can only speak for our role at the Friendship Centers or our pay levels at the Friendship Centers, and we're nonprofit agencies, nonprofit societies, and they're, you know, in any nonprofit, the pay levels, the pay scales are much less in NGOs than they are in, say, in government or in health authorities or federal or provincial or municipal governments. They're much less paid. So you have to attract people on a different level, right? You have to attract them for their values, for their wanting to be change agents, because people aren't working in our organizations for the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I hope that addresses your question, Peter, if I interpreted it correctly. Leah writes, thank you so much for this awesome discussion. With the provincial election coming up, which party do you feel is most supportive of Indigenous values in helping empower Indigenous people?
Is that this, Leah?
No, I wouldn't ask that question.
Well, which party? You know, to be honest, I haven't checked out all three parties. I know I can see what the Liberal platform is, and see what the NDP platform is, but yeah, I don't know them all. And you know, I think the most important thing is for people to get out and vote. If you are backing one party, by all means, get out there and vote for it. Please go and vote. That's what I want to say about that.
Snite writes, amen, Leslie. I wonder if you know of cross-cultural exchanges within mainstream organizations that would support the discussion and facilitation of teachings like in your paper.
Oh, that's a great idea, Sinead. I think that's a fantastic idea. I don't know of any. I know that there used to be a system within the provincial government that had sort of exchanges, or I forget what they were called, interchanges or something, and maybe there are but maybe that's something that we need to think about and set up. I've actually been thinking about that myself, and thinking about how it would be great for some of our staff who work in the Friendship Centers to go and get experience. When I worked in the Friendship Center in Duncan at Leila, I wanted to go and work in government, in the provincial government, to see how government worked. I needed to know that. In order to do my job better at that agency, I needed to know how government worked. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. And so I got caught up in government and never found my way back to the Friendship Center, but I'm back now. And I really think that it's a really valuable experience to bring in your federal government, your provincial government, your municipal government experience in. And it's important for them as well. I think I was doing a talk at one ministry, and it was a very, very high level talk to anybody, I think, who was a director and up in this one ministry, and there might have been about 100 people in the room who were there. And I asked them who you know, did they have any Indigenous leadership? They were asking me, you know, to how can they change? And I said, well, do you have any Indigenous leadership here? And they were like, no. So yes, they do. They need. You can't understand Indigenous issues or Indigenous values without having Indigenous people working with you. So if you want to be inclusive, Sinead's onto something. We do. I think those kinds of exchanges and interchanges would be a fantastic idea. Let's pick that up, Sinead.
Awesome, thank you. Sarah writes, do you have any thoughts on future federal accessibility legislation and how it could potentially help close the gap in equitable access to healthcare for Indigenous peoples on reserve.
No, I don't have any thoughts on that, Sarah. That's a really very specialized area for sure. I'd love to hear more about it. I like the idea of almost, the idea of legislating access, because one of the things that we've done with SANYAS, Indigenous Cultural Safety Training, is that we've provided people with the training. And so there's no, it's a nice training, and so they're done, and then now what? So let's look at what's happening now in healthcare. Is access improving? Well, if it is improving, that's great. And is it attributed to SANYAS? Is it not improving? Because I don't think it's improving. Put my cards on the table. I don't think it's improving. And so if it's not improving, why not? And what do we have to do to change that? So do we have to legislate access? Do we have to legislate anti-racism now? Do we have to strengthen those? We've developed the carrot. What about the stick? Do we have a stick to make people accountable for bad practice in healthcare? So I think that's a really good question. I'm interested to hear more about it, Sarah.
I agree. So much. Only way.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if Sarah was typing a response or not. I thought I saw her typing, but I'll give her a minute.
Okay.
So I thought I'd check in with the video conference participants and just see if there is anyone out there in the 3 sites that we have joining us today. If you have any comments or questions for Leslie, you can just take yourself off of mute.
I'm looking at empty boardrooms.
Not
Yeah.
necessarily.
Or you're hiding from the cameras.
Yeah.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Leolab. So we've been doing a lot of work for cultural competency with local, our local physicians and stuff. And we're trying to come up with a way to, like I know SANYAS does a lot of work. One of the things that we're trying to come up with is a way to present local culture to our physicians and non-native staff that work on our reserve. So my question is, what's the best way that we could present this to local staff? Like, we're just thinking of local protocols, local nuances and stuff like that. Like, I know you said before that the way you presented your program was to find a handsome doctor to deliver it. What would the best way for us to present something like that to people that may or may not be open to receiving such information, but would make for better care for our people?
Fiona? Thanks for that question. That's a really important aspect of cultural safety training. So when we developed the SANYAS, Indigenous Cultural Safety, Cheryl Ward was very, very clear that we wanted to do foundational decolonizing anti-racism training, and that we weren't going to get into talking about specifics of specific cultures like your nation, like Lilwa. And we're not experts in there, and that wasn't our goal. It was just decolonizing anti-racism training. So talking about the whole history of colonization of Canada, looking at the impacts that it had, and then looking at some skills that healthcare providers can develop in order to be culturally safe service providers. So the second stage of that would be the piece that you're talking about, which is providing cultural safety training to your own healthcare providers in your area. And I think there's many different ways that you can do that. You can do, Cheryl has schooled me in developing curriculum for that, and I like to wing presentations. I didn't prepare anything here today, but Cheryl liked to be very prepared for what she was preparing, and particularly I think in this area it's important for you to sort of have an outline of what you want to cover, But who you decide gets to develop and deliver that training is important for you to decide and for your nation to decide. I have been to trainings where I noticed that it was training from Indigenous people to mainstream Canadians. But I can tell you that the mainstream Canadians didn't get it. That they were sitting in that place. It was like a big house, and they were looking around, and they weren't very engaged. They didn't have any context or background or base to understand an Indigenous worldview. So they hadn't reflected on their own privilege as settler Canadians. They hadn't reflected on colonization or understood it, and perhaps they might have held some racist beliefs. So I think it's important for them to be ready for the training. So if they've taken the Sanyas training, and then so that would be stage one, and then the next stage for you is to think about how you want to develop that and deliver it in your community. And I think that's completely up to you for how, what are the important things that you want people to know about you. And it's kind of hard for us, for any human being, to try to think outside of your own cultural lens. But you kind of have to do that for a little bit and have to try to think of it from a mainstream lens. What do these people think when they see this happening? And, because we all know what's happening, somebody's getting brushed off, but what are they seeing? And so you try to see it and maybe practice it on a couple of people and get them to give you some feedback on how it's landing on them and how it's working for them. And also I think an important lesson I also learned from Cheryl was that people really need to feel safe when they're learning. So if they're feeling guilty or ashamed or closed or defensive, then they're not learning. They're not going to be learning. So that's all the advice I have for you, I'm afraid.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. I think we have time for one or two more questions on webinar. So Sarah had a follow-up. So she is writing from the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability.
Okay.
And she's engaging she's currently interviewing across Canada towards new federal legislation. So she says she agrees with you that equitable access needs to be legislated. Any ideas how we can better reach and encourage Indigenous persons to participate in their survey towards recommendations to the federal government?
So it is a BC Aboriginal Network on Disabilities survey? Oh, yeah. And you want more uptake. She wants more uptake on that survey. Well, let's give it a little... What is it called? What's the name of the survey? Where can we find it? BC Aboriginal Network on Disabilities Society is doing a survey on disability access. Go and check them out. Do they have a website?
They do.
Let's just get it up there and let's get their website up there and let them know.
Do they have a prize?
Yeah, is there a prize? Is it on Facebook?
Get it on Facebook. Twitter. That's awesome. Sarah says, thank you, yes.
Okay.
So Catherine had another question. She says she's wondering if you had any formal mentorship opportunities when you were developing your leadership skills, and if you'd recommend any particular organization that offers formal mentorship opportunities to women.
No, I did not have any formal mentorship opportunities. Maybe I did. I can't remember. I think I was offered some small mentorship opportunities. I think the Minerva Foundation offered, but they wanted me to mentor somebody, and I wanted to be mentored. I didn't want to be a mentor, but I did that. So there was the Minerva Foundation, which is here in Vancouver, which had offered mentorship to women. And let's see, where else has there been formal? Yeah, nothing really formal. There's but that's a good, important idea. Maybe that's something that we should be offering, that we should be setting up a network of mentorship. And I'm not familiar with any others other than that. For me, when I was looking for mentorship, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I actually just chased people down and kind of bugged them until they let me into their world a little bit. And sometimes they would shut me down. Like sometimes I was just like a question box, right? I was just asking too many big why, and they just got tired of me, because it was usually the end of the day that I spent time with these Indigenous leaders, and I was, just on a self-education quest and trying to understand what was going on in the world. So I think, probably if I could have had lunch with them or something, or set up regular lunches with people, then it would have been more, it might have been more impactful and maybe more appropriate than me just chasing people around and bugging them. So I think that's a fantastic idea. Maybe that's something that we should think about setting up as Indigenous women leaders and men leaders, and setting up formal mentorship.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question from the
Yes, got a
side.
question.
A question from the side. Hopefully we got
Come
time.
stick your head in
Do we have
here.
time?
Leslie, I know you do have to head off pretty soon
Okay.
for a flight, but do you have time for one more question from
Sure.
Leah?
Okay, well, the big question, I guess, is around supporting female leadership. And what does supporting female leadership look like? So we've got mentorship, certainly, as an opportunity, but I'm wondering also just about as women supporting female leadership. And I'm just wondering about that, because of the number of women that we see entering into education
Mm-hmm.
that surpasses
Yeah.
men in all fields almost now, and we're still not seeing female leadership
Mm.
at the very, very top. We're seeing it
Yes.
on the mid-levels, we're seeing it everywhere.
Mhm.
And what is it about, what is our role as women in keeping us there and not at the top?
Well, as you're saying that, Leah, I'm thinking about female Indigenous leadership, like political leadership, because when we are, there's so many amazing Indigenous women leaders here, but there's very few that are elected. So when you go to those meetings, the summit meetings, the EFN meetings and stuff, there's not enough women sitting around that table, and those are where, decisions get made. I found that true even at PHSA when I was there, that I was looking at, we know that more women are graduating from medical school than men, and there aren't, there was still at the top of every leadership. It's a Canadian thing, and we've got to fix this. We've got to fix this for ourselves, that there's, still more men than women at the top. And it felt like men take up a lot more space than women do, and I think there's, and that was maybe part of my struggle as well. So how do we get women leadership? How do we get women to take that next step? And how do we set up processes that enable us to actually promote women as leaders when they should be, and not 10 years after the fact, when we've highlighted this person as a leader for the last 15 years, but they're still at this level rather than this level. So those are good points. I don't have the answer for that, Leah. I certainly observe it, and I certainly observe that in our Indigenous community, we have a lot of women leaders at this level, and we need them up here at the top. And on that note.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you for your amazing leadership and what you role model. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing very candidly your stories and your experiences. And we've had a lot of comments on the chat box just saying thanks so much for sharing today. So we don't want to keep you any longer and make you miss your flight. So I just want to thank everyone from the UBC Learning Circle and from the First Nations Health Authority that helps us connect by video conference. And just to let you guys know that we have some sessions coming up you may be interested in. Next week we have Dr. Rosling in. She's talking about the empowerment of Aboriginal women, so I think that follows really nicely the discussion we've been having today. And on May 4th we'll have Kat Norris return for part 2 of her session on Without Reservation, her story as a survivor of residential schools. So please join us for those sessions and take care. Thank you.